Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is J. Brian Charles. I'm a journalist. I write for The Trace. We hope you had an opportunity to watch the film, The Price of Freedom, a new documentary that chronicles the influence of the National Rifle Association on conversations around gun policy in the United States. We wanted to build off the film and focus today on evidence-based policies that we know are effective in reducing the burden of gun violence. We are very excited to be joined by experts in the field who can speak to these policies as well as public opinion and the role guns play in our culture and democracy. We are joined today by Daniel Webster. Dr. Webster is director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Prevention and Policy, Bloomberg Professor of American Health and Violence Prevention, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He's one of the leading experts on the prevention of gun violence and has published widely on topics including the impacts of gun policies on gun trafficking and gun violence, enforcement of gun laws, community violence prevention, intimate partner violence, and suicide prevention. We are also joined by Cassandra Crifasi, Deputy Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Prevention and Policy, Assistant Professor, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Crifasi is an injury epidemiologist focused on the development, implementation, and evaluation of policies to improve public safety and reduce violence. Her primary research interests focus broadly on public safety, including gun violence prevention and policy, attitudes and behaviors of gun owners, and underground gun markets. We're also joined by Josh Horwitz, Executive Director, Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. Mr. Horwitz has spent 3 decades working on gun violence prevention issues. Among his many contributions to the field, his research and advocacy have been instrumental in new policies and social concepts that have been implemented in various locations in the country to prevent gun violence. Horwitz also helped found the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy, a group of mental health and public health experts who examine the intersection of guns and mental health. He is also the co-author of Guns, Democracy, and Insurrectionists, and the Insurrectionist Idea, published in 2009. We're also joined tonight by Janel, Cubbage, Director of Strategic Partnerships and Equity, Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. Ms. Cubbage is a suicidologist with experience managing prevention programs for the military, chairing and serving on state commissions and work groups, and directing state suicide prevention initiatives. She also works as a licensed trauma therapist, specializing in providing therapy for minority communities. Cubbage is a fellow of the Bloomberg American Health Initiatives and working towards her MPH at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and is passionate about healing racial trauma and actively working for racial justice and social justice. One of the strengths of the films was chronicling how the NRA went from a gun safety and training organization to an advocacy organization pushing back against any gun laws. Josh, you have been in the gun safety field for 30 years. Can you explain in more detail how the transformation of the NRA fosters insurrectionism in our current world? For example, like we saw in the attack on January 6th on the Capitol.
Yeah, Jay Ryan, thanks for having me, and thanks for being part of this panel. I really appreciate it. So I thought the film did a really good job of showing how the National Rifle Association moved from this hunting and sport shooting organization to an organization really focused on 2 things. One of those was much more self-defense and sort of fear of crime. But the other thing was fear of fellow citizens, fear of government, fighting government tyranny. I thought they really, that happened after 1977 as the film showed. And I thought maybe after Oklahoma City, that would go away forever. But at the 2000 NRA convention, people may remember this. Charlton Heston lifts a musket over his head and says, "Out of my cold dead hands, Mr. Gore." And what he was trying to do was create say, look, you can't take our firearms. The government's the enemy. But what he did is created a permission structure for the insurrectionist idea. And that idea is that violence in the political process was legitimate. And the NRA talked about that continues to talk about that. Let's be clear, they didn't tap into that really maybe because they believed it. They're all about making money for themselves and for the industry. But politicians going back from Newt Gingrich to Ted Cruz, and of course Donald Trump mastered this, echoed those words to curry donations, to curry those types of members and donations, and use that as a cultural warrior cry. The problem is that when you create a permission structure, people who can now buy all sorts of advanced weaponry like assault weapons buy into that. And they then feel, because they've been told that it's their right to take on individual tyranny, and take on government tyranny when they as individuals feel that way. And, one thing about giving individuals that much power and that much permission is that one person's tyranny might be another person's universal health care.
Yeah. So what we're talking about to some degree is wrapping gun rights, firearms, and even specific policies around guns, wrapping them in the flag to some degree, wrapping them in some of the ideas we have about even the foundational elements of the country. How difficult is it for someone to mount a counter argument when you start to say that what you're doing is you're attacking the very Americanness of Americans? I know that sounds almost redundant.
Yeah, it is a complete attack on American values, and it's a complete attack on the Constitution. The insurrectionist idea is an attack on what made this country, what in our founding documents. So the Constitution, it's important to understand that the Constitution was developed right after the Revolutionary War because there was insurrection and chaos in every major city on the East Coast and in the country. People needed more order. They needed a document. We needed to be able to follow the law and become a country of law rather than force. And that's what the Constitution did. The Constitution enshrined those principles of how do we settle things non-violently. So the idea that we now have this individual right to take violence against elected officials, institutions, that is an anathema to our founding documents and what I believe is the best of America.
Yeah, and it's very interesting though, an organization that it starts itself around hunting and fishing and things like that, it ends up getting itself into some version of protecting what it believes to be American core values, but does that in a way that seems to be warping those core values. What needs to be done to counter this? How do you go back to counter some of the things that the NRA has done, and what policies can take us back to a place where we can have safe communities and also allow people to participate in a functional democracy?
Number one, we have to fight back against the insurrectionists. Too many people just sort of let it go. And I've seen, even Democratic politicians talk about the Second Amendment and tyranny and stuff. You have to be critically and understand, educate yourself about what this means and understand what the Constitution means, and that the Second Amendment isn't something that allows citizens to destroy this country. So educate yourself. That's number one. But number two, we have to create safe spaces for democracy. And when I'm talking about safe spaces, I mean, I want the ability to go to the state capitol where I live in Richmond, Virginia, and not have to face a gauntlet of firearms when I walk into the Capitol. So things like keeping guns out of the Capitol, preventing people from open carrying assault weapons on state capitals and federal legislatures and other places, and also the right to vote. We've seen so much voter suppression going on, attempts to do that. One of the things that we've seen is that, there can be guns at polling places. Elections should be gun-free zones. You don't need a firearm to protect election sites, and they can only be used to intimidate. So where we practice our democracy in our city councils, our town councils, and our voting booths, we should not be intimidated by firearms, and firearms need to be prevented from those places because that's what it is. It's intimidation. And we can't have that in our democracy. We need those policies.
Thank you very much, Josh. While it's important to understand the NRA's role in current gun policy, we do have evidence-based solutions to reduce gun violence that have proven to work in states across the country. Daniel, the work of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Prevention and Policy and the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence utilizes the public health lens in developing these policy solutions. How is gun violence a public health issue? I mean, how does this impact work?
Yeah, well, the most obvious starting point is that gun violence has enormous impact on our health. It's a leading cause of death for young Black males, for example. It is a leading contributor to gross disparities in life expectancies across racial groups. But I think even more important than the actual direct impact on our health is what do public health ideas bring to actually solving the problem? And that's where I think it's particularly important. Public health has a community orientation to it, a population lens, and it's really 180 degrees opposite in some ways to the sort of the NRA libertarian line of basically. By the way, I'm trying to keep my cat from coming in front of my screen right now, so
Yes.
I apologize. Just 1 second. That was my cat, Satchel Paige. Just to complete that thought, the orientation is so much about what people do with guns as individuals has impacts communally, and we need to think and operate that way. And so for many of our problems in our society, we're very individualistic oriented, and we want to blame individuals. That only takes us so far. So public health models and solutions really think about systems, policy context of why are we having these problems and how can we fix them.
And would there be places which you could highlight that are taking that type of approach, that are looking at a public health approach to gun violence? And then there's several cities that are looking at this right now.
Sure, there's some great examples. I can think of New York City and Oakland. Both of those cities have really invested considerable resources into the communities where the gun violence tends to be the most problematic, with resources to reach the highest risk individuals and move them into safer kind of lifestyles and situations. So they've really invested in not just law enforcement, which we need, but also in changes in service delivery, as well as the other thing I want to really underscore about public health is creating safe spaces. So these cities are also investing in places that have been disinvested, addressing blight, because we know those set of physical conditions really affect social and social practices and behavior. So it is an exciting time to be working on this problem when more and more cities are having this orientation. And I have to give a little shout out to Brandon Scott, our mayor of Baltimore, who is all in on a public health approach to gun violence.
Yeah, for those of you who may not who joining us, and Daniel and I talk a lot. I write a lot about that public health approach here in Baltimore, which is something that's getting started, and we're hoping that particular effort works. One of the things, though, that comes up, and I'm going to segue into Baltimore a little bit because it was a place that has a lot of gun violence in it, is that Baltimore is a place that also is flooded with a lot of firearms. Industry regulations are essential policies to ensure that guns that are flowing through this country don't end up in the hands of the wrong folks. Daniel, what are the most important problems with the current laws and regulations of the gun industry, and what can be done to fix those?
That's a great question. Well, the movie, The Price of Freedom, of course, underscores the great influence that the industry has on the gun lobby and therefore on gun policies. The basis of most of our gun policies are pretty straightforward. We're trying to keep guns out of the hands of individuals who are prone to misuse them, and particularly in a violent way. The problem, however, is when you dig close to the details, the gun lobby has really written most of those gun policies to remove accountability from the people who are profiting from selling firearms. So they have all kinds of industry protections against really very reasonable practices of gun law compliance, accountability. They weaken the penalties for violating federal firearm sales laws. And they also make it very, very difficult to actually take someone's license away or take any serious action. You mentioned Baltimore, of course. We once had sort of a poster child of what the problem really is, a gun shop called Valley Guns right outside of Baltimore. Year in, year out, hundreds of their guns involved in crime in Baltimore. It took the federal government a decade to finally shut his business down and address that problem, principally because of all the protections that are built into federal law thanks to the gun lobby. So even the last thing I'll say is, you know, we've really learned that a relatively small number of gun dealers can have an enormous harmful impact on gun violence in cities like Baltimore. And research revealed that, and Congress did not respond with, hey, we got to do something about this. What Congress did is actually the opposite. They made it more difficult for us to look at the data to say which gun shops are the most causing the problems. And they also made it more difficult to bring lawsuits against them, which our research shows actually is incredibly effective at changing those behaviors so that people who sell guns do so responsibly and they don't end up in the wrong hands.
I mean, when we think about back a couple of decades, we think about another, you know, obviously dangerous product, which was cigarettes, right? And the cigarette companies were able to have suits filed against them. We had a big class action suit against cigarette companies. And then we saw some change in behavior, and we saw some change in marketing. We saw some change in a lot of the ways that those companies behave. Was there something that maybe in that process of going after that the gun lobby and the gun manufacturers, did they learn from what happened to Philip Morris and companies like that and R.J. Reynolds?
Oh, they definitely did. And so it was really essential to them. They saw the great threat that was happening because, honestly, the data was an incredible tool in this litigation, and it really revealed exactly what the nature of the problem was. And they knew that from the tobacco example that that could really change their business in ways that would greatly reduce their profits. So this was a priority for them to get protection against lawsuits that, again, our research showed in places like Chicago and Detroit, for example, we saw significant reductions in the flow of guns into those cities after the cities of Chicago and Detroit filed lawsuits against gun shops that were basically caught red-handed facilitating illegal sales.
So what's actually slowing down the ability to put some regulations in place to slow this kind of flow of guns? What's the block here?
Well, you know, it's not because the public doesn't feel like tighter regulations are reasonable and they want them. Our national polls show very widespread support for much stronger regulations and oversight against gun shops, and including just simple transparency. Look, we can look on our phones to look at what restaurants have had health code violations and try to avoid them. You can't do that with gun shops. You don't know which are the good actors and which are the bad actors. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
Yeah, we don't know who's actually doing it. You talked about Valley before guns.
Right.
We found out that they were a bad actor, but it would be very difficult to find out if there was additional bad actors, let's say if you were a person purchasing a weapon or that type of thing.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. So we heard a lot about the importance of regulating gun sellers, but we also need to think about gun owners and the access to guns by people who are a risk. Janel, you spent time working on a policy that is very relevant to the situation, which are extreme risk protection order laws. Can you tell us more about these policies and how they work?
Sure. So extreme risk protection order laws establish a civil process to petition the courts to temporarily restrict access to firearms for someone who has demonstrated that they are a risk to themselves or to others. And what's unique about ERPO is that it does reserve the respondent's due process rights. So there are court hearings that happen to determine whether or not the petition will be granted. And all of the petitions are temporary in nature. So when they expire, the respondent does have their firearms returned. ERPO was also developed with mental health equity in mind. So ERPO is also unique in that it doesn't require the respondent to have a mental health diagnosis in order for a petition to be filed, which is something that we've seen with emergency petitions, which has a similar process of temporarily restricting access to firearms, but does have the barrier of requiring a mental health diagnosis. So eligible petitioners vary by state. Some states allow healthcare providers to be petitioners, as well as family members and law enforcement officers.
This sounds a lot like what we see in domestic violence restraining orders. Explain the impact these policies have on safety, if you can, and try to give some idea of how these things make communities safer and prevent violence.
Sure. So the studies that we have do show promising evidence that ERPO is a tool to help reduce gun violence. We know from an analysis in Connecticut that on average 7 firearms are removed per subject or respondent. And for every 10 to 20 removals, at least 1 life was saved. We also know from analyses from various states that between 61 to 70% of ERPOs that are issued cited suicide or self-harm as the concern and the reason that the petition was being made. In California, we were able to conduct an analysis that showed that none of the respondents of ERPO orders in California went on to die by suicide, and none of the respondents went on to perpetrate mass shootings or homicides. So the data that we have is very promising, that this is a tool that can be used and empower communities to help reduce gun violence.
I just want to go back to one particular stat that you used there. The analysis in Connecticut showed that an average of 7 firearms were removed per subject. That was per person that got one of these ERPO orders.
That was per person, 7 firearms per person.
Wow.
On average.
Wow, that's something there. So we touched on how to remove guns from individuals in crisis or at risk of harming themselves or others. Cass, you've spent much of your career on policies that keep guns out of the hands of people too risky to have them in the first place. Can you tell us more about how licensing is another way to keep guns out of the hands of people who are too risky to possess guns?
Absolutely. I just want to start by saying we hear a lot in the news about comprehensive background checks. That was a policy that was highlighted in the film, The Price of Freedom. And I just want to start off by talking about how purchaser licensing laws are a complement to comprehensive background checks. So these are not sort of a substitute for, they work in concert with laws requiring background checks for all gun sales. So the process is someone who wants to buy a firearm first applies for and obtains a license or a permit. And these systems look at more data than are available in the National Instant Check System, which is used by federally licensed firearm dealers. And it gives more time for law enforcement to complete a background check. So under federal law, you get 3 days. If time runs out, the default is you can proceed with the sale. But in states that have licensing laws, you don't get your license until your background check is complete, which can take as long as 30 days in some cases. And then once you have that license, you can buy a firearm. Importantly, in addition to having access to more records, these background checks in licensing law states often are facilitated with fingerprinting, which we know can help reduce the likelihood that someone is prohibited, but would be missed on their federal background check. And you have to show this license to everyone you purchase from, whether it's a licensed dealer or private seller, which is how we can ensure people are complying with a background check for every gun sale. Now, when we think about the impact of these policies, we see really, really broad public safety benefits. So we've looked at homicide, suicide, fatal mass shootings, diversions of guns for use in crime. We all see, for all of these outcomes, we see reductions when states have licensing laws in place. We have some new research that also finds that these laws are associated with reductions in police-involved shootings. So it can make interactions between law enforcement and civilians less dangerous. And then when we think about background checks on their own, sort of thinking about comprehensive background check systems, these findings have been less strong, less conclusive. And so when you add the element of licensing, you really get a strong public safety benefit.
Yeah, yeah. We hear a lot in the media this kind of broad public support for background checks, but you just shared with us that they're not the only thing that we might need. There may be a need for licensing. Why don't we hear more about licensing as a policy solution?
That's a really great question. I think it can be easier to tell someone we should have a background check for all gun sales, and it can be sometimes harder to articulate what a licensing system is, how it works. But we've been asking about support for licensing on our national public opinion polls, and they actually have broad public support. More than 70% of US adults support these laws, and that includes 60% of gun owners. And actually, when you look at support among gun owners who live in states that already have these laws, support 75%. So I feel like there's a real missed opportunity to focus on areas of common ground, areas where there is effective policies that have broad support to really move the conversation forward.
Wow, there's a lot here. What I'm taking away is there are a lot of opportunities to reduce gun violence, not only because of the evidence backing these solutions, but because of broad public support. I want to take time to now ask our panelists some questions that we received. Josh, how is the rise of armed insurrectionism and armed protests, like what we are seeing in the capitals in Michigan and Kentucky, affecting democracy, voting, and the First Amendment? How do we make our communities even safer for democracy?
Well, it's a really interesting thing. It's a really interesting idea that the sort of unfettered insurrectionism sort of made up right, from the Second Amendment is imperiling our First Amendment rights. I talked earlier about the idea of exercising my right to petition government, to lobby, to vote, and to speak. And there's, of course, for many years, when I do a lot of work in Virginia, there were people in the hearing rooms when I would testify with firearms, and then of course they would show them to me and try to intimidate us and things like that. And we were recently able to pass a law that says you can't have guns in the Capitol, and it makes the world of difference, right? You can exercise your First Amendment rights in a way that's really meaningful, and so we've seen a couple of things. One is that democracy really matters. The pillars of democracy matter. Democracy can be fragile, and and what we don't want is we want to encourage people participating and making sure that capitals, that voting locations, county councils are safe is incredibly important. And so these are, when we think about safety, I'm thinking about preserving our democracy and the ability to vote and participate, which is incredibly important. The other thing I'll just say is that when we think about carry and carrying weapons, it's very clear that the states that have more, permissive concealed carry laws have higher death rates. Like that's been shown by a number of important studies. So I think what we need to do is we need to, I think, limit in places where guns are carried publicly, especially for safety. I just want to say, going back one thing to my comments. When I talk about the National Rifle Association, I'm not talking about all gun owners. I'm not talking, it's very important to understand that there is a political agenda that's being pushed, a money-making agenda being pushed. That's not true for all gun owners, but the NRA and their allies have created this permission structure where we now have guns at the Capitol in Michigan and Kentucky and other places. And that's really an affront that needs to stop.
Well, one of the things that you can see in the documentary, and this kind of goes to this point that you're talking about here, is that the NRA has built, despite some of the objections from a lot of gun owners, a lot of folks that are hunters or fisher or people who like to fish, they've built a structure that is a very, very well-oiled political structure. And I think about at these state capitals, Michigan and Kentucky, you have elections that don't always track with presidential elections, and you need to be able to turn people out. And the NRA does a pretty good job of turning out folks that are sympathetic to its position. How do you go out and turn people out and get people, moving on this in a way that they show up to vote? Given two things. One, I remember the line in the documentary is great. A angry and well-motivated minority can kind of overcome sometimes a kind of a majority that's not necessarily is motivated.
Yeah, well,
the other thing that I think about is that the fact that it's very difficult to get people to vote when they're able to carry weapons at the polls.
Right. Well, let me push back a little bit on the NRA bringing out people. What they're really good at is controlling the Republican primary system, and because there's so many gerrymandered locations, many electeds are much more afraid of their primary voters than they are of their general voters. Because they're safe. So when you think about that, they're good at and some of those voters are the same people, right? And the base of the Republican Party has really been taken over, right, by people who are Trumpists, who believe in gun rights, and so those primaries are really brutal. What we need to do is we need to make those general elections matter, and you can do that. But the way you do that is by making and working hard to organize people who feel strongly about gun violence prevention, and there are many of them. And you have to make this a salient voting issue. You have to show that it matters. And the one way you do that is for the people running for office to talk openly and honestly about their positions on gun violence prevention, because for many years, Democrats would hide their positions because they were afraid. No one's going to come vote for you for that. If you get out there, if you talk about your position, if you talk about the evidence that supports it, and you say what you're going to do in office, you win elections. So hiding doesn't help, right? The NRA will have motivated primary voters. Getting people to the polls means that you have to talk about your views. Gun violence prevention is popular. You need to say it, own it, and believe it, and people will come out.
So I want to move on to another topic, and one that's actually kind of hits home. We've watched over the last couple of years some of gun violence, start to tick up in places across the country. Baltimore, where Johns Hopkins is, where I'm based out of, is no exception to this. Skeptics will say that violent criminals rarely buy their guns directly from licensed dealers and have no trouble getting guns on the underground market. What is the most powerful argument that better regulations of licensed gun dealers will result in lower rates of gun crime? This is for Daniel.
Thanks. That's really a fundamental and central question. I'm glad you put it forward, Jay Brian. Well, the answer lies in Cass Crifasi's research. No, seriously, we've done a number of studies that show that, for example, when states require licensing for handgun purchasers, we see significant reductions in basically all forms of gun violence: homicides, suicides, mass shootings, shootings involving law enforcement. But importantly, we also see this strong effect in reducing diversions of guns into the underground market for criminal use. Cass led a great study that was focused on Baltimore, where we had both gun trace data and data from people on parole and probation in Baltimore City, a little anonymous survey that we did. And it really revealed that when Maryland adopted a licensing requirement for handgun purchasers, you saw immediate and substantial drop in these sort of indicators of diversion and straw purchases that go into the criminal gun market. And we simultaneously heard from the people who we surveyed that it was significantly more difficult to get a gun on an underground market and to get somebody to buy a gun on their behalf.
Yeah. So, you know, it's interesting that most gun owners would favor even some of these additional accountability measures. What's holding this up? Why won't we move on this if we know that the data says that, you know, better regulations leads to fewer guns out on the street in the hands of people who shouldn't have them?
I'll give my brief response to this, but maybe Josh wants to chime in as someone working on this for so many years. But I think people who are protecting the status quo and the people who are profiting really don't want to have a policy discussion. They want to have a culture war, and they want to base this on identity. So whenever we start to get to specific policy questions, there's a very quick pivot to make us an us versus them kind of scenario. And I think it's worked well for the other side to protect the status quo. But let's hear what Josh thinks.
Well, I would just say that we tend to see, especially these pitch battles in Congress, and Congress is completely dysfunctional at this point. I mean, you know, we saw that, you know, after the insurrection, people are still defending that idea, right? And so it's hard to think that that's a functional place. But what I've noticed and what we've worked on is that there's actually been a lot of movement at the state legislatures to get things done. And so even in places that you consider in the past very pro-gun, like Virginia or Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada, you're seeing real change there develop. And I think that there are people who are really hungry for better gun violence prevention policies. And so our idea is to work really hard at the states and get these policies in place, show that they work, and expand the map. I mean, we recently got extreme risk protection orders passed in 17 states in the District of Columbia. So I think where you make the case and you work in localities that are where there's still work to be done, we can make progress. Congress, I don't know the answer for right now. I think we have to reckon with the Congress is broken, and that's going to be a big problem for us. But I do think working at the state level and passing, especially, the state and local level, we've seen a lot of changes, both in policy and in the types of programs that Daniel was talking about earlier, like violence interruption and cure violence. So there's a lot of gains to be had, and I think there's opportunities to make progress despite the gun lobby's opposition to a lot of what we want to do.
I'm glad you mentioned a bit about extreme risk protection orders. I kind of want to go back to that. One of the things that I want to kind of touch on is on those extreme risk protection orders, how do we ensure that we get equitable access to these orders in Black and Brown communities, given some of the distrust that those communities have of law enforcement in the judicial system? This is for Janel.
Thanks for asking this question. It's one that's really important and central to our work. Part of that is to make sure that we're engaging impacted communities. We have these policies, and we need to make sure that we are messaging in a way that resonates with impacted communities to ensure that they're aware that this tool exists. But I think a lot of the work also lies in hearing them out about whether or not they have interest with these policies and how these policies might look implemented in their communities. The way that the policies are currently written may stand to be built upon to make sure that equitable access is achieved and that communities that can most benefit from these policies can implement them within their communities that feels safe and true to their communities. So if there are additional petitioners that could exist within their communities that could be written into policies, that's something that we should consider and be working with communities around. And I think that's an ongoing discussion that has to be had about existing policies, but also ensuring that we are engaging communities as we're developing policy as well. There's also
Okay.
importance in reviewing data around ERPO. So not only the petitions, but the petitions that are also granted and who those petitioners are and the reasons that the petitions were filed. And with that data, we can help monitor and make sure that these petitions and this policy is not being used or weaponized against minoritized communities or communities of color.
Yeah, one of the things that you see that becomes a through line for some of the larger, mass shooting events is the issue of mental illness. And ERPO is trying to address this, but do you want to speak a little bit to some of the misconceptions people have regarding mental illness, its connection to violence, and maybe kind of tie in how ERPO addresses some of that?
Sure, we've seen mental illness become the scapegoat for violence, especially tied to mass shootings. And the data that we have show that mental illness is not really a significant driver in violence. In fact, people with mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence rather than perpetrators. So that's one of the biggest misconceptions that I see. I think that people also have a misconception about what mental illness is from the definition of a diagnosable mental health condition. That means that 1 in 5 Americans have a mental illness. And I think that that's something that's lost among the general population. So ERPO helps to address this by its temporary nature and also ensuring that due process is central to the ERPO process. And it also shows and honors the fact that when we are experiencing a crisis, it's often short-lived and temporary. It's not a permanent state that someone remains in. So ERPO helps to address someone in mental health crisis by putting time and space between them and lethal means.
Yeah.
And some of the most foundational work and interventions that we have for preventing violence, whether it's homicide, mass shootings, or suicides, is putting time and space between a person in crisis and lethal means. With suicide, we know that the decision to make an attempt can occur rather quickly. About a quarter of suicide attempts occur within 5 minutes of someone making the decision to attempt, and that number jumps to 75% within an hour. So you can see how important it is to make sure that in those moments of crisis, someone does not have access to lethal means, and especially not the most lethal means available, which are firearms. So ERPO helps to create that time and space, but also ensure that once someone has returned to a healthier mental state and they're no longer in crisis, that they can still own or purchase firearms if that's something that they choose to do.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for holding on with, so everyone in our audience for staying with us this long. We got some great questions from the audience, and we're going to try and get to as many as possible. I'm going to start with one I'm going to ask all of our panelists. You have all spoken about how gun violence is a public health problem. Can any panelist speak about the ways in which gun violence is also a social justice problem, and how addressing gun violence from this perspective might affect solutions and policies? I'm going to leave this one open, or I'm going to start picking on people like we're in class.
Can I jump?
Come on. All right, Daniel, thank you.
All right, sorry, Janel, you can go first, and then I'll follow you.
Janel, please, go ahead, please.
To me, social justice and public health can't be unwed from one another. We have to approach public health from a social justice lens, and the nature of public health being focused on communities, structures, and policies naturally makes it a social justice issue. When we talk about minoritization of communities and how certain communities are denied access to power and resources, we're talking about the very structures and institutions that make that happen. And so I don't know that shifting or thinking about gun violence as a social justice issue would necessarily change a lot of the approaches to gun violence because social justice is embedded in public health. inherently. But it's a really good question, and it's something that we have to think about. And I think one step is naming institutional racism and the upstream factors that institutional racism creates to perpetuate inequities around gun violence and how that impacts certain communities.
Daniel?
Man, that's a tough one to follow because that's a total mic drop, Janelle. Great job. I'm just going to add a little bit to that and connect it back to some of the gun policy issues. Some people think of guns and gun policy as something completely separate from social justice and those sort of issues of so-called social determinants of health and public health. I actually think it's a perfect example of a social justice problem, and we've been talking about it. The way we have addressed gun violence is completely downstream. We focus our energies mostly in a harmful way, with our solution being police and prisons, and we look downstream to the impacted communities, and there is where we focus our energies and anything punitive, when we really should be looking upstream at how are these guns getting to the places they are. They did not drop from the sky. There are reasons for that. It is built exactly into the gun policies for people to profit upstream. So I believe very, very strongly that everything we've been talking about are the fixes that we need to make with our gun policies are 100% a social justice issue.
Yeah, I don't think, just one point I'd like to add here, I don't think it's by accident that the cities that we keep talking about with all this gun violence are cities with long legacies of segregation, long legacies of racism, long legacies of disinvestment and poverty. And we all know what those cities are, and they keep showing up on the list of places with the highest levels of gun violence every year. Cass, this is a question from a PhD student at SUNY Albany who's finishing up a dissertation on the NRA. The Price of Freedom talked about hunters whose interest in policy terms the NRA has continued to move away from and even undermined by supporting energy extraction interests, et cetera. What efforts are being made to reach out to those members of the shooting community, and what challenges remain? I mean, how are they going to people who are we would think were their core folks? How are they still keeping them in the fold?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing I want to say is the NRA talks about being sort of the voice of gun owners and sort of being the group that sort of people should turn to when they want to know what gun owners want to do, and sort of advocating on behalf of gun owners. You know, they say they have 5 million members. Well, about 25% of US adults own guns, which means we've got about 40 million gun owners in the US. So there are a lot more people who own guns for a variety of reasons than are members of the NRA. And so I think it's really important that we are connecting with those folks. I will say a lot of NRA members also support many of the policies we're talking about today, so sort of not to put those folks to the side. But one of the things that we've been working on as a gun owner myself, I think it's so important that we are engaging gun owners in the conversations around solutions. Just like any other public health issue, if you go into a community and say, we know what's wrong, here's what you need to do, this is, you know, how you fix the issue of safe storage or whatever it is, people are going to look at you and say, what do you know about me? What do you know about my community? What do you know about gun ownership? And so we've been doing surveys and focus groups, doing outreach with gun owning groups to make sure that when we are talking about safe storage, talking about policies, we are thinking about who credible messengers are. We're thinking about how we can meet people where they are so that they can be part of the conversation to be contributing to solutions rather than being a group that is talked about or talked to.
Yeah.
You know, we want to make sure we're talking with these groups.
Yeah, that makes sense. Our third question is something that I think Daniel and I are on the phone like every 2 weeks about. A panelist spoke about the public health approach to addressing gun violence. We received questions about the cure violence model, a community approach to preventing and reducing violence that focuses on individual and community attitudes. What are your thoughts on the cure violence model and other community violence intervention programs? What are your recommendations on how to ensure these programs are effective? Before anyone asks this question, I will suggest that we have a whole other panel about this, because we could do this for maybe 3 of them. We could do this, but I will leave this open to everybody here. This is a great question.
I'll take a whack at this, since we have talked a lot about it, and I've been studying this for over a decade now in Baltimore and other places. So I think there are aspects of the cure violence approach to reducing community violence that make a great deal of sense. And there have been some success in some places and sometimes using that approach. And for folks who don't know, just to really oversimplifying it, we're talking about hiring so-called credible messengers in affected communities to connect with the highest risk individuals to hopefully change the way they think about dealing with conflicts and provocations, and to mediate disputes when necessary. So I think there's that makes a great deal of sense. I think the problem really has been that we haven't completely filled that model out of what is needed for those individuals at highest risk in those communities at highest risk. I think that New York City has probably done the best job at really filling that out. And I'll do a shout out to my own advisee and Bloomberg fellow, Eric Cumberbatch, who works in the mayor's office overseeing a massive amount of community interventions. And they took that base model and they started to get more resources and services and supports to really change the lives of those individuals, rather than just say, we're going to try to change your attitudes about how to deal with conflict. You need to change people's lives and conditions, and I think that's what's going on in New York City and in other places starting to move in that direction. So bottom line, it's a good base and a foundation, needs to be filled in.
Yeah, that's anyone else wanna chime in here? Just to add on to this, I think Daniel and I have talked about this quite a bit, and I think one of the things that we keep coming back to is that the programs are wonderful programs, but there is kind of a need to understand that the moving dynamics of what's happening in these young people's lives all the time, and those dynamics are always in flux. And some of the group dynamics that we talk about that often dictate some of the actions that happen, and even in underground economies, is constantly shifting and changing. Janel and Josh, this question is for you. Mental health stigmatization and racism have always gone hand in hand in this country's history. We have a long history of institutionalizing Indigenous women and Black and Brown women, the same way we have a history of incarcerating Black and Brown men. Is IRPO based on mental illness, or is it possible that there's inequitable criteria being used for these assessments? Is that a concern?
I'll start. So we, in our recommendations, and we spent a lot of time trying to highlight this, is that we do not recommend mental illness as a criteria for an IRPO order. Oftentimes, violence and risk of violence behavior is multifactorial, which is why we think it's important to have a judge look at these things. But mental illness is really not the main criteria, and we don't recommend that you include it in an IRPO statute. What we do focus on is acts of violence and threats of violence, sometimes mixed with risky alcohol use. And we want to look at what we're asking in IRPO statutes, the judges to look at what is the impending behavior and what's the behavior going on, not what the status is. And so we thought a lot about this, and we did not want to stigmatize people with mental illness. We did not want this to be a mental illness intervention. We wanted this to be a violence intervention. And so we modeled that. And the other thing that we've done is we were really pushing data collection. So we wanted, if there are disparities, if this is leading to more incarceration, we need to identify that. So watching the data, this is a civil protection order. So watching the data is incredibly important. So far, we're not seeing these disparities, but we're going to, as this rolls out, we're going to be very careful. And if we need to adjust, we will absolutely adjust. But again, just to go back to this thing, our recommendation is that mental illness not be a criteria for ERPO loss.
I'm going to move to the final question because we're getting short on time. This again is going to go back to Josh. The Price of Freedom is a powerful film. Many viewers are eager to get more involved to influence change with regard to some common sense reforms. What are recommendations on how participants can help create the change envisioned tonight and generate enough political power to change the landscape on the state level? I think this is a great question to end on, so we don't go away thinking this is hopeless and we actually have a call to action.
So instead of making a shameless plug to join the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, I will say this: there is a state gun violence prevention group in your state. They need your help. They are often under-resourced, but we need to build those groups. We have a new initiative called the Safer States Initiative, where our goal is to have robust state gun violence prevention groups, and having individuals participate by volunteering, by going in the state capitol, by voting, by becoming someone who just is, not necessarily a single issue, but cares about this a lot. Join your state gun violence prevention group. You can find those groups on our webpage, the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, efsgv.org. Just look up gun violence, and there's a great group in New York and North Carolina and Wisconsin. They're all over the place. So wherever you are tonight, you can find a group in your state, join that group, get active, show up at the state capitol, not just this year, the year after that, the year after that, and the year after that, and you will make change.
I'm not sure if we're allowed to make shameless plugs for the Trace. I didn't say that. So, so I want to thank everybody, and also, get out there and actually join some of these groups and get yourself involved. I would say that I think it's important. I think a lot of people's lives are depending on it, and that's literal. I'm working on the front lines this every day, and I keep seeing people that are showing that are being often killed or sometimes disfigured and maimed. Mothers are burying their sons. Fathers are doing the same things. Their daughters. This is a serious issue, and it is a life and death issue. I want to thank all the panelists for their contributions tonight. I want to thank Dr. Webster. I want to thank Cass. I want to thank Josh and Janel. I want to thank everyone who put this thing together. It was a lot of work. We had a greatly good, very well done show this evening. I want to thank the audience for coming up with some great questions. I'm sure everyone on this panel will have more to contribute to this conversation as it goes forward. And everyone have a great evening. Sorry. Yeah, we'll be compiling your questions, and we will send out answers to those who didn't get their questions answered in the coming days, just so they know that. I was a little preemptive in calling quits to this. So we will be answering all those questions. And anyway, but thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.